So I didn't do any visuals, so I thought, I'll put something up because, oh, look at that. Look at that. Now, wait, my friend.
Yes, that's what you want.
That's the one.
Yeah. And then you can just, yep.
I was thinking why I'm not a painter. Lawrence was not a painter, but it didn't stop him trying. Yeah, that's one of D.H. Lawrence's paintings. Okay, so I'll keep touching it so it won't go away. I'll jump in. So, yeah, I'm going to talk to you about Frank O'Hara and D.H. Lawrence. These are reflections, so it's not even a work in progress, it's an idea in progress. So I hope you'll forgive the rawness of what follows. So I'm sure some of you know that Lawrence makes an appearance in a number of Frank O'Hara poems. There's the untitled poem that begins, I don't know as I get what D.H. Lawrence is driving at when he writes of lust springing from the bowels. Or do I? It could be the bowels of the earth, and so on. In Joe's Jacket, the O'Hara eye reaches for the, quote, D.H. Lawrence on the floor. The last verse of Lawrence's poem, Tommy's in the Train, provides the epigraph of O'Hara's for the Chinese New Year and for Bill Berkson. One or another we are lost, since we fall apart forever, forever depart from each other. And O'Hara's biographer, Brad Gooch, tells us that O'Hara, quote, owned D.H. Lawrence's poetry in the 3-volume set and referred to Ship of Death constantly. He's getting that from Bill Berkson. And writes that D.H. Lawrence was a favourite poet of both O'Hara and Berkson. So what? You know, what else? Why this coupling in particular? I'll come to it. But first I thought I might explain my relationship to the pair of them. Some context. So I first came across O'Hara's poetry during my undergraduate degree, of course I did. I wrote my dissertation about him in 2009, and even then felt that there was some connection between O'Hara and Lawrence. I used Lawrence's essay, The Poetry of the Present. It's a preface, actually, to his own new poems of 1920, Lawrence's new poems, to try to articulate what O'Hara was doing in his poems. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the poetry of the present? Yes, but I'll give you a little feel for it. Before the passage that I'm about to read to you, I'm going to chop it about a bit. Lawrence has been writing about the gem-like lyrics of Shelley and Keats, which lyrics he calls complete and consummate. But there is another kind of poetry, the poetry of that which is at hand, the immediate present. In the immediate present, there is no perfection, no consummation, nothing finished. There is no round, consummate moon on the face of running water, nor on the face of the unfinished tide. The perfect rose is only a running flame, emerging and flowing off, and never in any sense at rest, static, finished. In the way of poetry, then, Lawrence wants nothing fixed, set, static. Don't give me the infinite or the eternal, nothing of infinity, nothing of eternity. Give me the still white seething, the incandescence and the coldness of the incarnate moment, the quick of all change and haste and opposition. Certainly, Frank O'Hara gives him this, only some 25, 30 years after Lawrence's death in 1930. So that was my O'Hara period. Then came my Lawrence period. Last year I finished my PhD, which looked at working class cultural production in the English East Midlands, which is where I'm from. So it's not completely random. And a good portion of my thesis was given over to defining Lawrence's mode of authorship, which I propose is shaped by his outsiderness, his difference or foreignness as a regional working class writer, a writer on the margins, at the margins. So while doing that work, I was struck again by the correspondences between Lawrence's and O'Hara's work. Similar energies animate their poetry. They share similar convictions. Their writing about writing has in common an exuberance which comes partly from a profound investment in the direction that poetry should take. Not might, but should. So much of what Lawrence wrote about his own process, of what he would not do and why, echoes O'Hara's writing about the same. His positioning of himself in relation to his work and to the literary establishment. So, in 2009, I had this sense that applying Lawrence to O'Hara could illuminate the latter's work, the effects of the poetry, O'Hara's poetic sensibility, his intentions. Now, having spent some 4.5 years looking closely at Lawrence, I'm inclined to think that a thoroughgoing comparison of O'Hara and Lawrence's poetry, their critical writings and the letters even, could equally illuminate Lawrence's poetry and lead perhaps to its discovery by a new kind of reader. So, yes, it's worth me giving you an impression of the kind of poet-writer I think Lawrence is. There's a lot of opinion out there, so I'll just give my own. I'd like to be specific, but there isn't time, so I'm going to draw out 3 points of interest that I think compel a comparison. I'm going to do it really quickly. Repetition. There's a lot of repetition in Lawrence's poetry, repeated motifs, recurring images, language, and these repetitions draw attention to the materiality of the poems. There's a flatness to the poetry because of these repetitions. So, to reach at the fullest meaning of any one poem might require a reader to read across the poems because the single poem is intertextually connected to the whole of the Laurentian poetic discourse. Revision. Lawrence revised his poems and he revised them after publication. And these are minor revisions, really negligible, punctuation, really small. So you couldn't say really that they improved the poems. Perhaps they did, but more importantly, these revisions are the marks of a creator interfering with his work, agitating the surface of a poem, reopening the poem, substituting, making the work appear as if in a permanent state of incompletion or possibility. It's like the poem is an organic thing, and he's feeding it. It requires maintenance. Lawrence was a bit allergic to that deadening effect that publication had, but publication was necessary because he needed the money. Lastly, of these 3, presence. Lawrence has other ways of making his presence felt in the poems besides the revisions. He admits into his poems personal and political opinion. And the effect of this is to fix a poem in its time. This is different in the period that he's writing, which is, late 1900s through to, he died in 1930, so he's writing the whole time. I'm thinking the significant poem transcends its moment, it's for all time. Not so with Lawrence's poems, necessarily. I'm going to borrow from Amit Chowdhury, who writes about this brilliantly. He says that Lawrence's poetry refuses to inhabit a purely ahistorical place. No, it's not it. Purely aesthetic ahistorical place. Its insistence on incorporating idiosyncratic personal opinion and an extreme polemical voice is one of its ways of making itself exist in a specifically historic rather than transcendently artistic moment. Okay, so those are 3 things. From these idiosyncrasies emerges a picture of Lawrence as a different kind of creator, one who goes about things differently. His revising his poems post-publication destabilizes the idea that there is one artwork to be worked or chiseled out of the bulk material. Only ever the one work, and the creator laboring to bring it out intact, the perfect realization of his vision. This is just not applicable to Lawrence, who finds a number of forms in his material. If we take only the novels, there are 3 variants of Lady Chatterley's Lover. written one after another, written through whole each time. There are 2 variants of Sons and Lovers. Those variants have been published because they are sufficiently different and have merit. They stand alone. And I've sat down with, we've been talking about archives, I've sat down with those manuscripts, and they seem to me like living learning exercises, studies of the subject, of his subject, but also studies of their creator. They're working through. With each effort, Lawrence allows himself to be taken in hand, listens to the life of the manuscript as it this time takes shape. It's almost as if Lawrence were, this is very raw, it's almost as if Lawrence were a pupil of a master painter or sculptor, only he is both the pupil and the master. I'm trying that one out, precise. So that we might say that his Lady Chatterleys are, as you might read of paintings in a museum, of the school of Lawrence. And then we have the New York School as well. Anyway. So this comes down to an attitude, and that attitude is unusual. It is genuinely disruptive of the archetype of the genius artist, the solitary creator whose job it is to produce singular, gem-like works, and that he can do it makes him special. Okay, O'Hara. I'm kind of hopeful that as I've been talking about Lawrence, you've been thinking about O'Hara, doing my work for me. How similar their procedures are, or their attitude is. Okay, how is he similar to Lawrence? And this is going to be listy, but I'm thinking about O'Hara's debunking of the seriousness of poetry, about personism and manifesto. But how then can you really care if anybody gets it, or gets what it means, or if it improves them? Improves them for what? For death? Why hurry them along? I'm thinking about O'Hara's distaste for the literary, the academic, prevailing tastes in poetry, T.S. Eliot. I'm thinking about O'Hara's poem in praise of Gregory Corso, another poet. The false rear their many-coloured sheet, but at last we are liberated from the psychology of the non-such through Corso, vision agent, not creating a world, but choosing the world. I'm thinking of O'Hara's use of names of friends, places, street names, film stars that locate the poems in history and community, O'Hara's specificity. And we see Kenneth Cope doing this also in imitation and celebration of O'Hara in his poem The Circus, which opens, I remember when I wrote The Circus, I was living in Paris, or rather we were living in Paris, Janice. Frank was alive, the Whitney Museum was still on 8th Street, or was it still something else? I'm thinking about O'Hara's pursuit of the present in his poetry, his commitment to the running flame of the present, the now, his ellipses, paratactic syntax, and the Janus-like words and phrases at the ends of lines that cast meaning backwards and forwards at the same time. What Marjorie Perloff calls his floating modifiers, that is, word groups that point 2 ways. I'm thinking of the movement, the instability these modifiers create within a poem, making it nimble and immediate. So the critical reception of both writers is further inducement to bring them into dialogue with each other. This is very sketchy because of time. The word attention is one that comes up time and again in studies of O'Hara's poetry and Lawrence's poetry. The first chapter of Perloff's Frank O'Hara, Poet Among Painters, is titled The Aesthetic of Attention. Sandra Gilbert's study of Lawrence's poems is titled Acts of Attention. She titles her introduction The Effort of Attention, which comes from Lawrence himself. We keep talking about these connections. Lawrence wrote a preface to poet Harry Crosby's Chariot of the Sun, and in that he wrote, the essential quality of poetry is that it makes a new effort of attention and discovers a new world within the known. Amit Chowdhury, who I mentioned earlier, in his study D.H. Lawrence and Difference, he characterizes the poet Lawrence as a bricoleur. And then we have Rona's book about collage, which explores its influence on O'Hara's work, O'Hara's collage practice, and his collage state of mind. Okay. talk about headlong. Okay, so what I want to say, or to be able to say, is that O'Hara identified with Lawrence. There is influence and there is identification, and there is a difference between them, I think. There can be a passivity to influence. We aren't always conscious of our influences, and even if we are aware, it doesn't follow that we identify with the influence, with an influence. So identification is more active, I think. So I would like to say that O'Hara identified with Lawrence, with all the agency and purpose that is involved with that kind of a relationship. I think one of the things we can say with certainty about O'Hara is that he believed in the power of the creative network, the support network or system. And his giving of himself, his time, so often to others, other artists, his storied generosity is proof of that. But I wonder if the focus on O'Hara's support of others, his partnering the art world, has been at the expense of asking to what extent O'Hara needed support himself, needed that reassurance himself. We know he was not embraced by the literary establishment. He talked about it enough in USA Poetry and Larry Rivers' A Memoir and elsewhere. And so he looked to the art world and found his community there and nurtured it. I wonder if it is time to attend to O'Hara's need of encouragement, and as part of that larger project, to ask if he drew encouragement from Lawrence, a favourite poet.